Okay, I suppose for people watching this video or listening to us, we're going to have a kind of deep dive, close reading of a book about dexterity. It's called Dexterity and Its Development by Nikolai Bernstein. And the reason we're doing this is because we think that, well, when I say we, it's me, Kevin, and Keith. We think dexterity is probably the most important concept for fitness and health in general, but no one is talking about it, basically. So we're going to talk about it, and we're going to go through this book in some detail, and then we'll give some examples, and we'll use it as a jumping off point to talk about what dexterity is and things you can do to develop your own dexterity. You got anything you want to say, Keith?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to mention, like most people, when they think of dexterity, they think of like the dexterity of your hands, like if you can, if you're almost nimble or agile with your hands. But this is more, this is kind of, the book redefines dexterity in a different way, whereas like it's more about how you move through an environment and how you navigate an environment. So it's kind of the same concept, but very a lot more expanded. Like instead of just wisdom in your fingertips, it's wisdom about how you navigate a terrain or a habitat or something along those lines.
Right. Yeah. So like hand-based dexterity. People talk about like hand-eye coordination. That's just a sort of limited case of dexterity in general. So it's something that you can have in your whole body and your whole life. So we're going to kind of develop this idea. Maybe we should just talk about the definition then, because I have some definitions here. I'll jump to them and I'll cut back. We have, so like this is probably not a good place to start, is it? It's too dry. Let me see.
Yeah, people are going to love reading through all that.
Yeah, that was more just for reference after, because there was a few like later in, because it's got handicraft. I was just going to pick out a few words, that are relevant. Like, but anyway, fuck it. I'll delete all this out, obviously.
You could leave it in. People might like it.
We've lost all four people now.
Yeah.
So yeah, so dexterity is not just about your hand. Although the word dexterity, dex, refers to right, and is to do with right-handedness. Historically, the word comes from. But this book is by Nikolai Bernstein, who's Russian, so it's based on a different word. Dexterity is a translation of the word they use. We'll get to that at some point. But basically, it's kind of the crossover between physical abilities and mental abilities, and this kind of borderlands between them. You don't really know, is it more physical, is it more mental? And Bernstein himself calls it psychophysical. So this is from the very start of the book in Essay 1. And he says he's talking about psychophysical capacities, and dexterity is one of them. So people are much more, people are much more more familiar with the other capacities, force, speed, endurance, dexterity. So what would you say some examples of force, speed, endurance, and dexterity are?
Well, force, I mean, that's just like your physical strength. Can you lift an object? Can you do a bench press of a certain weight? That's what I would consider force. Can you physically move an object from one place to another? Speed is obviously how fast you can go. Endurance would be how long you can sustain some type of activity. But dexterity is different. I think one of the things that Bernstein.
I don't know, Bernstein, I don't know.
All right, Nikolai. He makes the point that dexterity isn't talked about a lot because it's not quantifiable in the same way all those other things are quantifiable. So force, you can measure the force you exert on something. I mean, that's like a concept of physics, like a scientific concept. Speed, you could measure the time it takes you to get from point A to point B. Endurance, you could time how long you could sustain a certain speed, or there's certain measurements, anabolic measurements that you could test for endurance. But dexterity, because it's more of a subjective thing, it's not easily measured. You would notice people have different capacities for dexterity in different domains, and it's not universal among people or the environments that they're in. So some people might be very good at navigating like a backwoods trail, while other people would be more adept to some other type of physical domain. So Bernstein makes the point that you can't measure these things, or you can't measure them in a way where it's comparable between individual to individual in a meaningful way. I mean, certain areas you can, but you have to have a more holistic view of what's going on in the situation and the context that the physical movement and the person are in to have an understanding of what dexterity is.
Yeah, I'll take this slide I'll take it to the next slide. It's got more here so people can read this. So like, I mean, to take sort of archetypal examples, force would be powerlifter, maybe speed, sprinter, endurance, long distance runner, or swimmer. And dexterity, well, it's more like, it could be some, maybe like if you stick to like athletic sport, it may be they're like someone doing the decathlon, so they're able to do all these different events. That would be maybe closer to it, because they're more able to do many things. So we'll get to the definitions and stuff soon, but also they'll be. But then it just gets to things like just normal life for you. You know, there's a cool video where a guy. The guy's driving along, and they've recorded a CCTV camera, and the guy's driving along on a motorbike, and a pram goes rolling across the road, and it's on quite a steep hill, and it goes across the road, and it's going like horizontally across, and then it gets to a dip, and then it starts shooting down the hill. But the guy's already spotted in advance. He's driving along his motorbike. He leaps off the motorbike, sees the pram go running, and he sort of runs. This is all like in 2 seconds. He starts running back down for the pram, and in the middle of it, he takes his rucksack off and throws his rucksack off, so he's lighter and he's more able to grab the pram. Runs down and grabs this child that would have like obviously died in the baby that would have died in the pram if he hadn't caught it. It's all so fast. He jumps off the bike. Bike doesn't even look damaged, anything, and rescues this kid. Just happened so fast. So when people see this, they'll say things like, "Oh, he did it instinctively. You know, it was amazing instinctive reactions." But what do you mean? How could you have an instinct or like a reflex? How could you have a reflex or an instinct for that? So what you were like, there's a gene for driving along on a motorbike and seeing a pram come across the road and roll down a hill and telling you how to jump off and run down and catch it the highway. So it's obviously, it's not one thing. It's a whole collection of skills he did. How much of it's mental? How much of it's physical? You don't really, a lot of it's physical. Obviously, he had to jump off the bike and do it. But he was the mental aspect, he's understanding it from a distance, what's happening. He's kind of calculating how fast he needs to run. In the middle of it, he realized he needed to take his bag off, he wouldn't have caught it in time. I'll link to this video underneath. It's amazing. But so your dexterity, you're just using in daily life all the time. One thing I love about your stuff, Keith, your fitness stuff, is you seem to be training dexterity. You're not just teaching people how to do one movement over and over and over again. You're teaching them you're talking about doing different movements in different ways and developing them and experimenting with the movements. And you're always, the physical movements are always being infiltrated by your mental, sort of like an understanding of the movements and guessing and thinking. It's not just repetition, pick up the weight and lift it so many times. And sorry, on you go.
Yeah, no, I was going to agree with you. It very much is it's also a mental exercise, and it's the idea here is like you're trying to become both physically and mentally flexible so that you're adaptable to the situation as it calls for it. So it's not like you have a plan, like you've planned something out for a long time. It's you're able to call upon whatever skill that you have based on the context that you're in at that point. And so it's something like you mentioned the way I train it. It's like novel situations aren't really something you can train for by virtue of them being novel. But you can maybe think through context or examples in your head and move through them in a certain pattern. So maybe you gain a piece of that skill. And then when an actual situation comes along where you would use it, you're able to fire on that same type of pathway and maybe adapt as necessary. But yeah, it is also, it's thinking about it. It's thinking about it in the moment, having the wit to be able to do it. And that's also why it's not really measurable, because it's the results aren't always replicable. So if that in that video, say the same guy was presented with the same situation, he may have reacted differently on a different day, still maybe would have saved the baby or whatever it was. But the idea would have been that it's not doing the same thing over and over again. It's accomplishing the task in an intelligent way using the skills that you've had. So you could do that any number of ways and still accomplish the same task. One thing that I think we maybe glanced over, but when we were listing out those other concepts, which were force, speed, endurance, finally dexterity, the idea is also that each one of these is increases in complexity. So force is not very complex. Force is just the amount of pressure or strength or whatever it is that you have.
And it's much more what we normally think of as physical. So like the increase in complexity is also going from what we normally think of as physical to what we normally think of as mental. And then they're all involved, but just sort of more of one than the other. And seems to increase towards the mental as you get to dexterity.
Yeah, so there's force, speed, endurance, and dexterity. You increase in complexity for each one of these. And then another thing that he mentions is dexterity is a function of control. Like that's its main role is controlling a situation. And that's directly related back to your central nervous system as well. So if you freak out in a situation, that's not a good example of dexterity, because you've essentially robbed yourself of any type of controlled ability to navigate that situation. So I think that's maybe a big concept to consider if you're looking at the crossover between the physical and the mental. If your nervous system is not trained, that's your main conduit between how you think and how your body's going to react. So that I think that's a main component of dexterity as we're describing it. If you want, Kevin, I can to kind of illustrate this better, I could bring up my screen about the example of going from like hot to cold.
Because in the book he's got a nice sort of, the book's really nicely written, by the way, people. It's not as like some of this might seem dry with the quotes, but it's really like written in an entertaining, engaging way. Everyone should read. Everyone, if you're watching this, you should definitely read it. And in it, he has a sort of nice game. No, not everybody. No such thing as a book everyone should read. But he has this nice kind of game in it where he sort of names things. Is that dexterity? And then like, well, you know, that game kids play. You're guessing. You're getting warmer, cold, colder, warm, hot, and then they get it right. And so you can read that in the book. But yeah, let's do it now. Let's come up with some examples, and we'll see how hot or cold we think they are, how close to dexterity. One other thing about dexterity is that related to what you said is it's difficult to measure it because you have to use dexterity in order to judge dexterity. So your ability to be dexterous, this intelligent physical behavior, you have to have some of it to be able to judge when you see it. So like you have to be able to know whether that was a difficult thing or whatever. So you can't really have sort of the dead machines recording and pumping out some numbers to tell you what it is, because you kind of have to use your mind to judge it. Anyway, on you go.
Yeah, so I made up a couple of slides just so we could illustrate it, and it's basically some of the same or similar examples that he gives in the book, but it'll be easier to understand the concept. So the essentially the action that I'll be talking about is walking or locomotive movement. So obviously, here's an important point. I think you have mentioned it to me previously, Kevin, but the idea is it doesn't take a whole lot. If you're able to daydream while you're doing something, it's probably not high in dexterity. So the first example would be really cold, and you'll see on the screen here that it's just walking down a sidewalk, or I got this guy he's in the metaverse, so it takes no dexterous movement. There's not a lot of physical thinking involved there. So obviously when you're walking down the sidewalk, you could just daydream about anything, think about anything. You're not really paying attention to where you're walking, or there's not a lot of complexity there. One step up from that would be hiking, like on a trail, a paved trail or something. You may come into, step over some fallen branches or navigate around some puddles or something like that. But it really,
so there's like a bit of variability in the ground. It's not exactly the same movement on repeat. Your slight changes as you're going.
Yeah, elevation changes. There'll be steps. You may have to, whatever. It's the complexity increases a little bit more beyond that. Even warmer would be if you're doing like a trail run on an irregular trail. Yet you're still on a trail, so it's not completely like the amount of variation that you're going to come in contact is not completely unknown. You kind of have an idea. Here's the trail. Here's where I'm going. So it's not only the physical aspect of what you're doing, it's the entire environment too. Like you have a say it's a 5-mile trail, and you have a map, the loop that's going to bring you back to the beginning. So you're not thinking about where I'm going, where I got to get to. You just say, I stay on the trail and I run, and I get to where I want to go.
As an example for people, if you're lost, if you've gone the wrong way in the car, or you're lost, you're completely engaged in every single street, every corner. You're thinking exactly where you are. You're in the moment constantly until you find where you are. If you know where you're going, you've done it 100 times, you're thinking about something else, and then you at the end of the journey, you go, don't even remember traveling, because you could just do it on autopilot. So like on the trail road, the trail's there. You don't need it. There's no fear really, because you know that the trail's been made already. You can see it. You don't need to think about that. That's something that you no longer need to think about. So there's an element of automaticity. Yeah.
However, you're still trying to figure out how you want your feet to land on the trail, so you don't twist your ankle on a rock or fall in a ditch or whatever. And then the I guess most dexterous thing would be if you're just navigating. Say I have to make it to. You're navigating in like the backwoods, so you're working with like a compass and unpaved trail. There's no trail. You're just navigating over the land. So that's kind of the pictures I picked here, is just guys going over like a rock outcropping, and you really have to think about where you are placing your hands and feet as you move over this terrain. 2, you have to constantly be orienting yourself to make sure that you stay in the right direction. And then in this type of environment too, like lots of times you also have to take into consideration things like the weather. your elevation, your oxygen levels at different elevations. So there's so many different elements of complexity that get built in here, and it really does test your wisdom to suit yourself to an environment or adapt yourself to environment, to make sure that you can, one, survive and get through it really well. So that's kind of the progression that makes it easier for someone to see like what dexterity really is. Because like I said in the beginning, it's not being able to use your fingers nimbly. It's being able to make wise decisions about accomplishing a task. So in a physical environment.
Another couple of things I'd add to this is there's different ways to look at it. So yeah, the physical aspect is it's getting more and more complex, from just walking on a pavement to walking on like really rough rocks where it's like becomes physically dangerous, and the variation's huge, and there's like things that you maybe need to jump, and becomes more and more difficult, more complex, or harder to guess. But at the same time, there's the mental side of that all the time. So you're daydreaming on the pavement. You're very engaged if you're running on these rocks on the top of well, if you're not very engaged when you're running on top of these rocks, then you're probably not around anymore. So you're kind of forced to do it. For the navigating thing, you're also dealing with your emotions, your fear, because am I lost? Will I die? Will a snake bite me? Will, whatever. There's things can happen to you for real, especially if you really don't know where you are before, if you haven't been there before and you're having to figure it out. So you've got this whole body, whole soul, like your whole soul is involved in this. Obviously, there'll be times where you see a stretch and it's kind of requires less thought, but other times you'll really have to be aware of your surroundings. And this is just like walking progressions. If you just go from walking, this is kind of the difference. So there's all sorts of other things, like you get more and more difficult, catching a ball, all up to, like really difficult way of catching things, acrobats, all the same kind of thing. And war obviously would be ultra hot if you're in a war, because everything is involved, everything's at stake. So there's something has to be at stake for dexterity. That's part of it. It needs to matter that you manage to do the thing. There has to be some kind of goal that you're trying to achieve, whether it's just survive or whether it's, do a cool trick to show off and impress a girl or whatever it is. So what are some other examples? So we've gone from, like a walking example, or some other kind of things in normal life where you would use dexterity.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to point out is like, you could have athletes performing at a very high level in whatever sport that they're doing, but it's not necessarily that performing at a high level means that you're high in dexterity. So like an Olympic sprinter would be performing at a very high level, but it doesn't take a lot of dexterity to be able to perform as an Olympic sprinter. You're on a track, you're going in one direction as fast as you can.
So they would be extremely well coordinated, obviously, and many other things, but you wouldn't call it dexterity compared to, It would be more dexterous if you were a football player, either kind of football, American football or soccer, where you're sprinting one direction, then you suddenly have to switch quickly to another direction without, falling over to avoid people. You really don't know what's about to happen. So there's that kind of element of being able to change things around, and that's a higher level cognitive thing. You're deciding, you're making a decision. It's not a reflex. You don't have a reflex. Like, you can't have a reflex for all these things that happen in life, because a lot of them are very, very different. It's not even like you've repeated it so many times now it just comes into play. It doesn't, because even if you take those rocks that those guys are running on, it's never the same. It's never ever the same. So something is deciding, making all these little calculations in you. You get better. The decisions are better based on practice of similar circumstances, but it's always reaching out into something new and then developing and improving. It's not just replay of old moves. It's more like constructing new movements and then you by becoming more dexterous, you develop the ability to construct more and more new movements that are better for more and more new situations.
Yeah, it's almost as if like over time, people with more experience become more dexterous because they have just more wisdom about certain things. So I'll bring up this other. This is a tweet I had here, but the main idea. So in a previous job, I worked a lot with technicians, like mechanical technicians, and they. What I always notice is that the more experience that they had, the more intelligence they had in their movements. Like they knew how to take something apart, and it wasn't just taking something apart, it was applying the right force to take something apart in the right manner, and then one, knowing how to put it back together, two, knowing exactly what you had to do and when you had to do it. And if this happened during this instance, like that's when you slightly changes your path off of that to correct for I don't know, a certain issue. And so it's a lot of this is experience driven, which I think is another reason why it's not quantifiable, because a lot of times you can't quantify someone's experience in these things, but you can see it when it's when someone has it. So I mean, it stands out to me, one, the technicians that I've worked with, two, you see musicians, especially musicians when they're just kind of like jamming or doing improvisation, because you're completely a new territory there. Especially if you haven't played music with certain people before, you're just coming in fresh and you're playing with a new group of musicians. You kind of have to play off of each other and the different energy there, but still make it sound good. So there's a certain level of I don't know, intelligence and knowing how to use your ability in the moment. And I think that's a big component of dexterity there. So I don't know if you want to go into more kind of examples of this, or you think people maybe have an idea at this point.
Well, you've used the word there, craftsman. So like if you think of crafts, that's, crafts, craft work. It's usually like, so that's, you can see how it was focused more on the hands then. It's things you create with your hands. But these are just as much mental as physical, these things. It's like you're creating something, you maybe have a vision roughly of what you want, and then you adapt over time. It's not the exact plan you create, but it's also not just completely random. There's kind of an interplay between your mental vision, your mental model you maybe have of the goal of the end product, and then you create it. And then this word craft is interesting because later when people are crafty, it means that they can do things. Sometimes it means kind of crafty can mean kind of bad, but not necessarily. But it means you can pretend, you can be going one way and then suddenly go the other way. So it's like the sprinting thing. It's like the runner, in a sports game, is be able to quickly switch direction. But there's also a mental component of quickly switch direction, or quickly, if you're creating some art object, like extreme dexterity to carve a beautiful statue out of stone. It's like insane. Your whole body, mind is involved in that to physically do it, but you have the person to align the physical world with their vision. That's that mind body connection, you would say, or I'd maybe say a mental and physical coordination happening for you to do that. So that's just in crafts. Dexterity obviously more associated with the right hand, tends to be right hand, left hemisphere of the brain. And language, not the same for everybody, but like over 90% of people, it's like that. People tend to be better with the right hand. For humans, we seem to be specialized for for specific fine motor skill with the right hand and your left hemisphere, where language usually is for most people. So there's a connection between words and actions. So again, you're like coming out of the physical territory because you're using words to, when someone does a piece of art, often they've been taught how to do it in words from someone or images from someone. They're having to think and then do something, then think some more, then do something. And a lot of things you're thinking while you do them. So when you see like a talented person who's really good at their craft, you admire it. And there's like a reason for admiring it, because these people are crucial to evolution. There's a reason women love men who can do all these different things, because that's the guy who's the most dexterous. There's like, it's a different guy from the biggest, strongest, toughest guy is not necessarily the most dexterous guy. You need both in a group, but they're not, they're maybe kind of conflict with each other slightly. But everyone admires people who can do things well, and everyone admires people who can do many things well.
We discussed this before, but if we're looking for some like real world examples of real world, mythological or fictional examples or like archetypes of a dexterous individual. One that I thought of initially when I was reading the book was Odysseus, where he's described as like a very good at tactics. So obviously he's a warrior and he fights in the Trojan Wars and all that, but I don't think he was known for his stature so much as he was for his intelligence and being able to have good tactics. So the one example that comes to my mind is when he's captured by the Cyclops in the Odyssey, and obviously the Cyclops is this big giant that overpowers them or whatever and is going to eat them. So he has to think about, you're not in that situation ever before. You're put in that situation. Now you have to get out. And what is the wit and physical capability that you have, and the environment too, that you have to get out of that situation? So I think he tells him his name is nobody. So that's just thinking, that's crafty thinking to tie it back in that idea. Two, I think they figure out a way to trip the Cyclops over. So instead of trying to take him on, in an actual fight, Odysseus and his men trip him over and then stab him in the eye with a big stick. And all of those things are to win the situation, to succeed in the situation, but it's not just through strength, speed, overpowering someone. Like, you have to think through it, use the environment to your advantage, and also to think beyond the situation as well. Like coming back to using his name as nobody, he's thought about, okay, I'm out of this situation, and how do I continue to outrun the next hurdle that I may come in contact to before he's actually gotten to that hurdle. So that's a great example of dexterity. Another example, more modern, is in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Captain Jack Sparrow, he always has there's always a scene where he's trying to escape, like he's been captured and he's got to escape. And you can't really tell if he's planning out the escape or if he's just making it up as he goes along. And it maybe is a little bit of both. Like, yeah, I think the joke is always that he's planned the whole thing, but as you're watching the scene, obviously he's just throwing it together haphazardly and it happens to be working out. But that's another example of dexterity, being able to navigate the situation and even overcome the pitfalls as you're trying to carry out your strategy, getting through them and still making it out and making it out safe on the other side, so to speak. But those are just two examples of, like, you see dexterity in action. Like you watch the physical capability meet with the mind and navigate through these challenges, and you get to the other side, and they make it out okay. But it's not just for sheer will, force of will, and it's not for sheer strength. There's something else to it. There's an intelligence behind it, and how they're moving through and using the environment to their advantage. So it's almost like the entire one, you have yourself as a tool, like you have your body, your limbs, whatever you can do, and your own abilities to run, jump, swim, throw, catch. But then all of a sudden you have the entire world is also a tool to solve whatever problem it is too. So the chair in the corner is not just a chair, it's also a step stool, or like the to take, I think, like Jack Sparrow, like the sail on a ship is not just a sail on a ship. It's now something that you could swing off of to get around a situation. So I think those are two examples, and I think they illuminate kind of that spirit of the dexterity and how it's used, and they're kind of larger than life examples for, but they really show how things are used, and like obviously you could dial down the theatrics and then apply those concepts to your own life. So yeah, I just thought those were two examples. And the thing is, it's not to be dexterous is not to meticulously plan something. It is to have a plan, but it's also to be pragmatic with that plan and know it's like you're constantly thinking one step ahead, following through on the action, and then shifting as needed. So it's a very small feedback loop. So you get action, and then reality will send you a message, and you have to react, continuously react to that, and then just step forward one step at a time. And obviously, like, so coming back to the example of someone traversing like a difficult physical terrain, and you think, okay, I'm going to get to that next peak, but you're also thinking about which step, how to place your feet in each step so you're not rolling your ankles. And then like the next moment it starts raining, so maybe your strategy has to change a little bit now, and you have to contend with it being muddy and wet as well. So you're thinking about that as you're trying to continue on this course or your route that you're going. So yeah, I'm just trying to illuminate the idea of dexterity, and how people can see different examples of this, and just really latch onto the idea. Do you have anything to add, Kevin?
Yeah, well, I mean, based on those two are the best examples. Like the Odysseus has always been, for me, like the patron saint of dexterity. Just like when I first mentioned this book to you, he was the first person you thought of as well. I mean, he's called resourceful Odysseus constantly, or variations on the word resourceful. And Bernstein in the book, resourcefulness is one of the, later when he comes to a proper definition of dexterity, resourcefulness is one of the key criteria. And in Odysseus, yeah, he's like the man of many twists and turns. So again, you've got that switching from one, you're going one way and then switching to another way. Jack Sparrow, I hadn't thought about until you mentioned when we were talking before, but it's perfect. And he's also a good example of the most dexterous characters that often kind of amoral, or it's not clear whether they're the good guy or the bad guy. Not always, because again, the dexterity is just, it's an ability to make the best out of any situation, and it doesn't necessarily match with morals, because you can, a very dexterous, physically agile person can use it to jump off a motorbike and save a baby, or they can use it for climbing in a really small high window and burgling a place. It's the same set of skills. So like characters like Jack Sparrow are kind of, he's kind of on the outside, but he's also kind of a good guy. But it's not clear. Part of his dexterity, another level of complexity, is then you're saying it's not clear, does he have a plan or is he just winging it in the moment? Him not letting people know whether he has a plan, or making people unsure whether he has a plan or if he's winging it, is part of the dexterity. It's part of keeping your options open and being able to take advantage of situations more. All of it factors in.
Think about the intelligence intelligence. Maybe it is intelligence. I don't know. Like think about what it takes to actually think that far ahead in terms of like, maybe the best thing to do is not to instill the confidence that they know I'm going to get this done, but to instill the skepticism, because they don't know if I'm going to get this done. And it might be advantageous to me later on in dealing with these people if they don't know that I'm competent or not. So like, to obscure your own competence intentionally, in terms of Jack Sparrow, that could be a good thing, because they also, like in that example, is like, okay, you could write him off as a fool, and that might be advantageous to him down the line if people think that he's a fool when he's actually not. So
for definite, and like a big part of dexterity,
navigate that mentally is incredible.
Because we were talking about, we started obviously with the walking examples and on the cliff, walking on the cliff. So like we're thinking about environment being the physical environment, which obviously is part of your environment, but other huge part of a human's environment is other people. So like you're dexterously navigating how they're going to react and how you think they'll react, to have an effect on them this way, and then what will happen, and then they're thinking of like second order, third order effects all the time. This type of intelligence comes out of planning, of seeing. It's kind of like seeing the future or modeling possible futures, but not committing to any of them. You're not like one of these idiot guys whose model is the world. But you've got all these models running, and then you're maybe applying them in different contexts, but you'll switch them to something else if it's not working. It's like the pragmatic thing that you said. Jack Sparrow uses things in the moment. Odysseus is, this whole story is him being switched around, and then him dealing with being switched around. So the environment is switching him around. And to go back to Bernstein, he says, he talks about that dexterity is, what's common in dexterity is finding a motor solution for any situation and in any condition. So you don't just have this set group of abilities that you run around trying to apply everywhere. It's that you're able to solve problems when they arise, and that so that dexterity, because the dexterity is revealed by solving the problems, new problems that arise in the world, new situations. It's not in you really. It comes from the environment around you. It comes from either dealing with the people or dealing with the physical environment. So the conditions need to change for you. You can't just sit down and decide to meditate on being dexterous and then get up and be dexterous. Obviously, you have to kind of interact with the things that are happening around you. And sorry.
Well, I was going to make a point that, like, you're exactly right there. It's not something outside of you, and it's not something inside of you either. Like the actual thing here is the interplay between those. So it's not like if you're trying to lock this down or like try to work through it in your life, it's like it's not necessarily something that's going to come internally, and it's not going to. You're not going to be able to look at something and just think about your environment. It's going to be that interaction between the two, and how you're interacting and how you have them play off of one another. So it's mobile, it's fluid. So that maybe that's also part of the reason why it's very hard to measure this, is because you could measure how much something weighs, or you could measure, to a certain extent, you can measure the intelligence of a person, but can you measure how well they're going to think about moving that weight to accomplish a task? And that's what dexterity is.
And you can,
is
different
that
people can solve
middle
the same
ground.
problem in a different way. So like you can, there's more than one way of solving things. Like say there's a physical situation you need to deal with. You know, in the book he has examples of like a soldier who gets cornered in the building and he has to jump out over he jumps out the window and lands on the gunman and then turns around and fires back up at all the other soldiers who'd run in to get him in the building. So it's like this really quick-witted thing. And that's another thing he talks about. It's motor wits, quick-witted motor behavior, more finding movement solutions. But that just blends straight into mental wits, quick-witted. We think of someone with as always has a good answer back to someone. They're quick-witted, or they make jokes. That's type of dexterity. Most people who really have really high level dexterity and making jokes tend not to have high level dexterity and physical agility. They don't always go together for different reasons. So the maybe it's useful for people if we talk about the word, because like the word for dexterity in Russian, the guys, he calls it I think it's love cost. I'm obviously butchering the pronunciation, but it comes from catching. So again, it's the hand thing, but it comes from catching and trapping. So it's about trapping animals. So it was a word used to describe animals that were good at preying on other animals and catching them, trapping them. And then that became the human who was good at trapping animals. That's where their word for dexterity comes from. So, I mean, if you think what a trap is, that's a trick. It's a plan you had in advance. You set a trap for someone. You're thinking about a possible future. You're thinking from their point of view how they're going to fall for it or what would give it away. Then you have to set up the physical conditions. So maybe you're diving into a stream and try to catch a fish with your bare hands. That's dexterity. But you also may be setting a trap for in the woods for some animal and then for dinner later. So to improve your dexterity. So better to say. So when dexterity was developing in humans, it was from what they were doing in real life to survive and their normal. It was just being dexterous was just your life. And this is still the same. It's still the case with a lot of hunter-gatherers. There's so many different things they have to do that your just dexterity is just normal. For us, it now becomes some weird quirk that some people have because everyone else is just kind of rigid and doing one thing really well, and they're not kind of open to do many things. And we even have this phrase, jack of all trades, master of none, which is kind of related to how it's emerged now. But so it always has, and this goes back to the monolity thing I was saying about Jack Sparrow. So it has this kind of connotation of catching and trapping. So like you could use dexterity to corner people, whether physically or mentally or emotionally or and verbally. You can use it grasping. So this idea of grasping with your hand will be grasp an idea. So this is like left brain, right-handedness. You're like grasping and controlling things. It's about controlling movements. So you can do something, so you can accomplish some goal. And there's no clear dividing line of when it's physical and when it's mental. They're kind of there all the time. Even if you think like a power lifter, or if it's something based on pure strength, there's a point where it's no longer strength. They can push through a little bit by their mind. Their mind can make them push through a little bit, or they can quit. So like there's still an element of mental in that, although obviously some people are just going to be born stronger based on their genetics and their training and size muscles, blah, blah, blah. A runner is the same. You have to have a mental focus in order to sprint really fast. You have to really, there's a mental component to that. Endurance running, you want to quit and you have to talk to yourself to not quit. And then, you tell yourself in advance, I normally feel like this at this stage. It'll be okay in a while. So there's that intelligence built in. It's not just simply you can go for a while. And then when you get up to more and more complex things, dexterity seems to break away from physical stuff entirely, and you're like doing weird philosophical arguments about specific things, or It's really like computer programming. That's kind of like dexterity of being able to manipulate lots of objects and link them together and make them do something. It's kind of like that's separated from the physical world, and now it's very abstract. And but this is where it comes from. Like this kind of the ability to do that doesn't just appear on its own. It comes out of people being able to do all the physical stuff first. Does this make sense?
Yeah. The one thing, so I want to bring this back down to like an example of like something someone can do. So if you and a friend have your friend pick up an irregular object like a rock or something that's not shaped uniformly, and it may have like different weight depending on like the different side of the rock or whatever. So if you have to catch the rock, they throw it to you, and like if it doesn't take a lot of dexterity to catch a ball, right? Because a ball is a round shape and you'll just be able to grab it essentially. That's pretty easy. But a rock, if it has like a sharp edge and then part of it weighs more than the other part of it, or it's got a thin side and a thicker side. So someone throws that to you and you have to figure out how to catch it. It's very much in the moment that rock is falling. You have to be able to see how it's turning in space so you have it land in your hand the right way. And if it's sharp on one edge, obviously you want to avoid that edge. And then you also, because it's irregular, you can't grasp onto it evenly with your hand. And you also have to slow it down, decelerate it so that you can bring it from the motion to a stop. So there's so many things that are going on there. You're reading the situation, you're physically moving your hand to try to adjust to that. And you also have to think about how to do it, not get hurt, and complete the task. So that in my mind, that's like a small little example of like how to be dexterous, just with something as I guess stupid as throwing a rock to one another. But if you don't know those different types of movements in terms of deceleration, how to position your hand and kind of gauge dynamic trajectory and all that, then you're going to fail at the task. You're going to drop it, or it's going to hurt your hand when it hits. So being able to catch it softly and also accommodate for all those different variables, you actually have to think about what you're doing as you're doing it. For a lot of people, that'll be intuitive, second nature, but for other people, it just won't be. So I just wanted to bring it back to like some small example where like you could figure it out. And I'm not a huge rock. I'm saying like if you try this and the rock is 5 pounds or 7 pounds or something, you'll be able to do all that and also learn when you can't do it really quickly because you might get hurt or something. But yeah, so in one of our podcasts, I wanted to. Eric brought up a really good phrase, and I think it plays right into dexterity. He said something along the lines of physical charisma. And that's just another way of thinking about dexterity. It's being able to oh man, the words are escaping me right now, but I mean, when someone is charismatic, I mean, they have the ability to kind of almost shapeshift into this situation to make themselves welcomed and all that. So in terms of physicality and doing that, it's the same thing, like adapting yourself, shapeshifting into the situation as it calls for it.
Which again is like Odysseus with these in disguises.
Yeah.
It's all, everything is in Homer. The more I read Homer, the more I realize that everything is there. You've even got the difference between Odysseus and Achilles quite helps demonstrate dexterity, because Achilles is obviously like the straightforward, strong warrior type. It's all about honor, and it's it's like one direction. So like, the game kids play, who would win out of Superman and Batman or whatever. So who would win out of Achilles and Odysseus? Well, Achilles would win in a straight fight, but Odysseus wouldn't have a straight fight. This is the point. So like the whole story of the Iliad is Achilles won't switch and change. But then when you come to Odysseus, he's switching and changing all the time. But then there's questions over his honor and morality. It's not quite. It's not as straightforward as Achilles. So you kind of, right at the start of Western literature, you have this kind of interplay between the strong brute force warriors. So I mean, Achilles is all these things. He's agile, he's fast, he's everything. He's the best. But there's a level of being able to switch around, being able to change things, be able to solve problems in a different way. There's also, like, in the Iliad, Odysseus is in the Iliad as well, obviously, and there's an interesting thing where when they get sent to Achilles to try and persuade him to come back to the war, and he goes to tell him, here's all the things that Agamemnon all these gifts he's going to give you. So he says he's going to give you this, 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 and he reels them all off by memory perfectly and repeats them exactly as Agamemnon said. But he misses out the very last sentence where he says, and then he will know how to submit to me. So Odysseus just cuts that bit out. So like, Achilles knows what's going on because he knows, well, he's kind of like a guy like me. I know what he's up to. Whereas Odysseus has kind of been a little bit sneaky or crafty, and he's trying to get around a bit. But the whole time it's just taken for granted that he's also an accomplished warrior and can fight. It's not a question of he's like some wimp guy who's kind of clever. It's kind of built on top of those other things. It's taken for granted. So in terms of like doing something to make yourself more dexterous, would be to find a way that whatever you're doing that you're accomplished at, whatever your strengths are, is to find some way of adding in variability to it that you can't choose in the moment. So like if you like running, run down some hill that you've never run down before and see if you survive. Don't sue me. If you or set up, if you're with other people, you can get them to put obstacles in the way that you aren't expecting. Obviously, if you do martial arts, if you're sparring, that's what it is. There's like different ways you can make yourself be forced to switch around and decide in the moment and make new decisions while utilizing and bringing into play all these other skills you have. So you can think of like dexterity at the top, recruiting all these other skills and coordinations and abilities you've built up over time that gives you more options. So you need these other things. You can't just be dexterous. You need to learn how to coordinate yourself, how to walk, all these things at a lower level, how to speak, how to social interaction with people. And then you have to start developing a level on top of that where you can start picking and mixing what skill you need for the moment. And this can all just happen so quickly out of awareness that you mistakenly think it's not intelligent. You think it's just instinct, but it isn't. You've had to do a lot of thought and decisions and trial and error to get to the ability to make that what seems like an instinctive split-second decision action, but it's actually really intelligent behavior. So I just like to make things, because somebody asked me, because of when I'm doing like posture lessons, people often ask me what kind of exercises should they do, and I tend to just give them a sort of vague strategy rather than specific things. Do things that will train dexterity. So uncertain conditions, variable conditions, you're forced to be present. You can't daydream when you do it. I think I got that from Erwin Lacour. He said somewhere that when you're doing some exercise, you shouldn't be able to, I can't remember his exact word, but you shouldn't be able to think about something else, something like this. I can't find the source. But so to do things where you're having to think. So like what if you do something
where you have to like,
you have a goal,
bring your whole self to it.
Yes, like and you have to figure it out. So like the figuring out is good. It's so like getting this solution. Oh, okay, I did this thing that's really dexterous. Go and do this thing now. Okay, so I have this like bar and I flip on this bar and then I do this jump and then this all in one row. And then somebody will go, okay, I'll go and copy that now. I'm dexterous. So it's not quite. The dexterous is the figuring out what you had to do in that moment, the uncertainty of it. Every time you're having to figure out and make mistakes and take a risk, you're training your ability to get better at not just solving problems like that in the future, but the ability to solve problems is getting better. So the problems you can solve are higher level, but also your ability to get better at solving problems in general improves. This is dexterity. It's problem solving with your whole body mind. You could think of it like that. It's not like... Sorry.
No. Finish your thought.
I was just going to say, it's not like the difference in dexterity and coordination is coordination. You're putting things together in the right order, but you're not having to recruit new. I don't know how to describe it. You're just not making new. You're not making new decisions, and you're not making new movements. If it's something physical, if you're just repeating the thing that you've coordinated before. So like this, like you're just it's something has to be something new in a way, or just unexpected. There's that uncertainty of it, because if you think about it, when you're doing something, you know how to do it. You're already, you know what's coming next. Your brain can switch off. If there's a slight element of, like if you're in the woods training rather than in a gym, if you're just in a random place in the woods and there's not many people, depending on what country you're in, you might be like, to keep an eye out for snakes or something here where I am. There might be something, or even like why people walking the dog, some crazed dog that isn't able to walk on the streets. They might be out in this part of the woods with their dog off the leash. Like it could come running around the corner at any moment. This happened to me. Well, actually, I may as well tell that story. I came running around the corner, sprinting in the woods, and this giant dog came running at me. And I'd seen the dog chained up in a house quite nearby. A guy with like 5 dogs. This is the one dog that was chained up all the time. So you know this dog. And it came bounding at me really fast. And I got such a shock when it ran at me. Like I froze, it didn't do anything. But I kind of calmed down. Well, I got, adrenaline going and everything, fear, like real fear. And then I sort of calmed down verbally to myself. And then I went away around the corner and started doing sprints up a hill. And I immediately hurt my back, immediately injured myself. So what caused the injury? Well, it was the psychological impact of that moment meant I was no longer as present in my movements. Part of my mind, you would say, was now used up, or chemicals flooding my brain. It takes like half an hour to go away. And I was unable to do what you would think were just coordinations that I'd done a million times, sprinting up and down a hill. I've done this millions of times. This is like I do all the time. So the coordination, what you would think was coordination you had built in, you trained it, and you can just do it on repeat. Actually, because now your mind is involved in something else, it didn't work as well. So that tells you your mind was actually involved in it all the time. So you like your mental presence, you get away with it sometimes, but as soon as something changes, you're fragile. And in that case, I was fragile too, like a scary dog with a slivers dripping down its mouth. Still have its image in my face. And that took that was just like a 1 second action, and then it affected me for weeks after.
Yeah. Oh wow, weeks after.
Yeah, like with injury. I mean, yeah, like I had an injury. That wouldn't go away. So adding a fear-based component is useful for training. I mean, you can get too extreme with this, obviously, but adding something where there's like, if you think of the things kids love doing like physical activities where you're not really meant to be doing them. They're not like evil, but they're kind of like, naughty. You're not supposed to be there. You're getting away with something. There's that drama, that excitement that adds, some people have this all their life, obviously, but that excitement is part of it. That's making you, it's stimulating the requirement of dexterity is now more now. It's not like you're not just even though that same movements would be the same. You can walk across a wooden beam on the floor, on the ground, no problem. Stick it across slightly high. It's the same beam, but you might have trouble walking now because you're thinking about the fall. It's not like it requires dexterity now, even though technically it's the same coordination. But it isn't really. It's a different situation now. Lots of examples of this for training.
For awareness, because the stakes are higher.
Right.
So injury or a misstep at at a height of 10 feet or whatever is a lot different than misstep at a height of a foot. So yeah, that the stakes have risen. I think that's why, I mean, people get addicted to it, the thrill seeking sometimes, like adventure, people that are into adventure sports or extreme sports, they get addicted to the adrenaline rush and everything else that comes along with it. There's something too, I mean, what you said about your mental capacity in your example getting used up by being confronted with the dog.
Let's call it a wolf. Let's call it a wolf. It was in the woods and it was big.
A wolf, yeah.
We'll call this wolf. Yeah, I was talked by wolf.
Or chihuahua or whatever it was. So I've been really pushing these breath hold tables recently, and I tried one yesterday, and I got to my fourth hold, and I was going strong through the fourth hold. I got to my fifth breath hold, and all of a sudden I felt like a little like twitch in my back, and that threw off my concentration right there. And I still had I think almost 2 minutes left in the hold, and I couldn't hold it. And I just stopped because it was like that. You have to get into the zone for some things, and if you get thrown out of that, it's very hard to retrace back into it. But that's the same thing in terms of like your mind is being used so completely for one thing, to complete one thing, and then when your attention is forced into another domain, then you fall off track, and like you just don't have the mental capacity to complete the physical task any longer, or complete it the way you want to. But yeah, that's just the example in my life as you were describing that recently I came across it. It's almost the same thing. Like, I didn't get injured, obviously, but it was like I just lost the capacity to do whatever I was doing for that session.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely about dexterity, holding your breath. It sounds like it's physical, or you're just holding your breath, but at some point your mind is telling you you're going to die or whatever. And then another part of your mind is saying, no, this is part of the game. You're going to feel this, but you're okay. And then you're talking to yourself. So that like kind of controlling your behavior, controlling your movements using words in your head is like a next level of dexterity up. It's not just simply movements.
Also controlling your physical movements too.
And you're using them. They're connecting together. You're making your physical movements adhere to what your mental verbal movements, the pattern of those, or the structure of your verbal movements. You want the physical movements to correspond with them, and that's a skill. That's dexterous. That's like you have to be. There's plenty of people who know plenty how to throw words around and then can't put them into action at all.
Yeah, back to the example that I said earlier. Dexterity Dexterity is a function of control, and it's also controlling your central nervous system too. So that plays right into.
I have a quote about Odysseus here that I'll share my screen if you put your one off. This is from the Iliad, and it shows how it's about control also. So he's the war's going on outside Troy, and King Priam is asking Helen who the warriors are. So they've got to the duel. It's the duel between Menelaus and Paris / Alexandros, whatever you want to call him. And so the two sides have stopped. They've all taken off their armor and thrown it on the ground, and they're just sorting out the duel. So he's asking Helen, because she obviously knows all those guys, who these guys are, and he's pointing out the most kind of, the heroes basically. Who are these guys? And so he sees Odysseus, and there's a few things here, but it's interesting to read because it describes dexterity in many ways. Without it being about movement. This shows how it's about control. It's as much, dexterity is as much about not moving at the appropriate times as it is about moving in the right way. So I'll just read it out if anyone's listening to this rather than watching it. So next, again, the old man asked her, seeing Odysseus, "Tell me of this one also, dear child. What man can he be?" shorter in truth by a head than Atreus' son Agamemnon, but broader, it would seem, in the chest and across the shoulders. Now, as his armour lies piled on the prospering earth, still he ranges like some ram through the marshalled ranks of the fighters. Truly to some deep-fleeced ram would I liken him, who makes his way through the great mass of the shining sheep flocks. So I'll stop there a second, but this, if you've ever seen a ram go in amongst the sheep, it's like has this poise and quote unquote erectness about it that is, this image makes perfect sense if you've ever seen it. And it makes you think of poise and energy and directed focus, not just simply like brute strength. So anyway, you'd have to see this image. So anyway, Helen, the daughter descended of Zeus, spoke then in answer. This one is Laertes' son, resourceful Odysseus, who grew up in the country, rough though it may be, of Ithaca, to know every manner of shiftiness and crafty counsels. So there's different translations of this, but basically they all have this kind of idea of craftiness or cunning devices, and they have these kind of phrases. Shiftiness, that's like we would talk about switching about, being able to change direction and things. This just sounds like Jack Sparrow. In his turn, Antenor of the good counsel answered her, surely this word you have spoken, my lady, can be no falsehood, since once in the days before now, brilliant Odysseus came here with warlike Menelaus, and their embassy was for your sake. To both of these I gave in my halls kind entertainment, and I learned the natural way of both under close counsels. In one of the other translations, it says, instead of the learned the natural way of both, I learned both of their statures. Stature is a word I use a lot in the posture lessons, but it also is there's a mental, emotional aspect of stature as well, social aspect to it. So now, when these were set before the Trojans assembled and stood up, Menelaus was bigger by his broad shoulders, but Odysseus was the more lordly when both were seated. So that's just posture and poise. So he's like, that's the difference between the big fighter guy, the strong guy, and the more dexterous guy. He's able to sit better. You know, you haven't seen these big muscly guys, they sit down, they just kind of collapse down. But when they stand up, they're like big and terrifying, but they don't know how to sit. So like I see this all the time. It's professional opinion. But anyway, so now before all, when both of them span their speech and their counsels, Menelaus indeed spoke rapidly in few words, but exceedingly lucid, since he was no long speaker, nor one who wasted his words, though he was only a young man. But when that other drove to his feet, resourceful Odysseus, he would just stand and stare down, eyes fixed on the ground beneath him, nor would he gesture with the staff backward and forward, but hold it clutched hard in front of him, like any man who knows nothing. Yes, you would call him a sullen man and a fool likewise. But when he let the great voice go from his chest, and the words came drifting down like the winter snows, then no other mortal man beside could stand up against Odysseus. Then we wondered less, beholding Odysseus's outward appearance. So I love this section because he's talking about posture, poise, and presence. It's the three things that are all through this. So like we'll start at the end. He says they're thinking he looks like a fool because he's not moving the staff, because they're used to people getting up and they're just reactively throwing the staff around and being emotional. And then this guy is holding it still. He's not moving it, so he's got complete control over his physical actions. He's like talking, they're like in a high stress situation. Obviously, these are like warriors. He's in a hall with the warriors, trying to convince them to give back Helen with Menelaus. And he's not reacting to that. He's not moving. He's not fidgeting. He's staring at the ground. So I imagine this is like he's getting it clear in his head what he's going to say, structuring his words, being planning maybe, or maybe even physically preparing himself and getting his body in the right structure as he's standing. You don't know. And then the people think he looks weird until he speaks, and then it comes out and it's all like articulate and he convincing and whatever. But he's using many more words than Menelaus is using. He's the much more like the strong, simple guy with few words. You know, everyone knows this archetype. So you've got it basically mentions posture. He's sitting down, but he looks bigger when he's sitting down, or more lordly. It depends on the translation. You've got him being able to not react in a stressful situation, standing up. Public speaking, this is the thing that fears people most now. Most people are either becoming completely rigid to keep themselves in position, or they're just fidgeting like mad all over the place. Odysseus isn't doing that. He's clearly not caring that he looks like an idiot. So he's like got control of his actions. He's controlling his reactions to other people's reactions. He's not imagining this bad situation where people are thinking bad of them. He has, there's just like what I love about this, there's so many details that there's no reason to put these in unless they're trying to describe what a dexterous man is like in normal life. And it's complete control of himself. It's not moving well as moving well. It's just taken for granted. I mean, at the start here, he's ranging around the troops like a ram. So he's like, looks like the ram, and the normal soldiers look like the sheep. So he's already physically has the physical prowess and has more poise and more ability than everybody else. That's just taken for granted. And they're making a point of saying there's this next level of it that we're calling dexterous. They just call it resourceful. There's in another episode of this, we could go into the Greek word they use for this because it's really interesting, but it basically means dexterity in my view, which dexterity even has a spiritual component to it as well as mental and physical. And so I would just recommend anyone, there's lots more in the Iliad that's relevant to this as well. But Odyssey is obviously the main one for this, but I like this because it's comparing the two types of guys, the strong, straightforward warrior and the kind of cunning guy who, he knows how to treat people. He has total command over his words and his movements and his mind at the same time, which is, to me, is all the levels of dexterity.
Yeah, stay on this slide because there's one thing that I think is interesting. One, it says, this one is Laertes' son, resourceful Odysseus, who grew up in the country, rough though it may be, of Ithaca, to know every manner of shiftiness, craftiness, and counsels. Shiftiness and crafty counsels. So I don't know necessarily what the culture of Ithaca was, but what this brought to mind was, and I know it's a different reading of country, but more like people from the countryside tend to be more dexterous in that they have to be more dependable on themselves to figure out situations, especially dire situations. Like there's certain areas of the countryside where if you have to call an ambulance, they're not going to be able to arrive for an hour if you're out there really remotely. So it demand like that style of living compared to someone in a city who they have all these conveniences afforded to them at all times.
They've outsourced their dexterity. It's been outsourced.
Yes, exactly right. So I thought that was just interesting, and I know that's not the way you read country here is not how it's read, but like that's what popped into my mind. Oh, maybe like people from the country are often.
Well, in one of the other translations, I think they call it, rather than say rough, though maybe they refer to it being rocky or mountainous. So they're and barren and rocky, something like this. So they're implying that it's really uncertain, variable environment that he's had to learn how to deal with in different ways, like those guys on the top of the cliff that you showed earlier. And they're implying that this physical environment has now become his personality or his way of being, which is deliberate in my view. They're deliberately saying this because, they have this very psychophysical, the people come out of the earth, out of the place where they are and stuff. They're not separate from that. That's why they're all saying where people are from, who the father is. And obviously the crafty counsels is the strategies and plans, good ideas. It's not just dealing with. It's not just react. There's the two things: reacting well to new things that come up, and then having the good ideas to plan things ahead and the interaction between them. And like Bernstein in the book, later in the book, we'll come to this in another episode maybe, but this idea of being resourcefulness is one of the key factors in dexterity. And this is how often they translate that word from the Greek. They translate it as resourceful, talking about Odysseus. It's too perfect a match. I don't think we're just picking an example at random. I think this character, Odysseus, let's call him character, is it's just the expression of this archetype that's been there since the beginning. And also, like, if you think of the difference, what's the Iliad is about, there's these kind of, you're saying about the rural countryside person who's more dexterous. It's kind of like the rural gangs against the city guys who are kind of lost their touch. They've lost their edge. And, it's kind of, I mean, really the Iliad's as much about Hector as it is about Achilles, just from the different angle. It ends with Hector's burial, doesn't end with the actual invasion of Troy and stuff. But so you have like this kind of concept where, because they're in a city and everything's easier, they're not as dexterous, they're not as good warriors anymore, they're not as crafty. They've kind of lost their edge compared to this sort of more rural gang type mentality. And that seems to be what the whole theme of the books is. And it's still playing out in guys. So like guys watching this, like what the things guys do is training, whether they go to the gym and pump weights, whether they like do these other things, whether like you in your garden swinging your mace around in weird ways and doing weird jumps and stuff. Like it's, or whether they're, parkour, or whether, like people are attracted to different things based on where they kind of fall on this spectrum of type of man. A lot, and it's just interesting to think that there's like a lot of the training advice and a lot of all the things that people are doing just kind of miss out the dexterity part completely. It's just that they've got this mindset of you just get the list of things and then you do the things, and now you have those abilities now. And even if you do a broad range of things, it's really so you get them down, you automate this one and automate this one and automate this one. And now you're more productive in terms of movement. It's that kind of mentality. But really the dexterity is about putting yourself in new situations and figuring out how to solve the new problems, whatever the situation is. And,
really is the figuring out is the important part, and not the result. One thing that I brought up when we had talked about doing this previously was that dexterity, as it's described, relates back to the true, and you also mentioned this in this reading too, or right after it, about the spirit of dexterity. So to me, dexterity relates very closely to the archetypal masculine spirit. In that it is, it's bringing order to chaos constantly. So like if you're in a new environment, if it's unknown, and anything unknown is kind of chaotic until it becomes known. So you're using yourself as the tool to bring order to that chaos, to organize it in a way that whatever actions continue to happen, or you facilitate more growth, or whatever it may be. And that's the original masculine spirit, or at least a component of it, is to bring order to chaos. And it's the skill of all like heroes. Odysseus is a great example. He's obviously in all the Odyssey is just one chaotic environment after another, and he's just bringing, he's ordering them. Not that he's putting everything into order. He's not destroying chaos, but he's kind of wielding chaos. He's learned to almost bottle it and make his way through the world. And he's obviously been takes him however long to get back home. but he's kind of learning to ride those waves of chaos as opposed to being overtaken by them. And I think that is just plays so closely right in line with what Bernstein talks about in terms of dexterity. It's learning to figure out the unknown in real time and have the wit and physical capability and combine both, psychophysical, combine both your mind and physicality in a way that is contends at the highest level with the unknown situation that you're in. So I think that was just important to mention. It's just what we're actually exploring here is not only like the practical side of dexterity, but there's also very it is an archetypal spiritual side that dexterity inhabits. And like you said, Odysseus, he was coming straight from like the origins of the Western canon. Maybe this is one of the more important components of society that maybe is forgotten or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, one way to view Homer is it's the development of dexterity. This book is called Dexterity and Its Development, because at the very start you have people think the inciting incident in the Iliad is like the argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, but it's not really, because otherwise it's all of these old warriors and stuff would have just argued and fought all the time, and one would have just killed the other and taken over, and there would be no story. But the real inciting incident is they argue about, he's going to get his prize taken away, and he puts his hand on his sword and he's about to attack him and kill Agamemnon. And at that moment, Athena, the goddess, appears and convinces him to not, and so he takes his hand off his sword and he doesn't do it. That's the moment where it changes, because now he consciously inhibited his desire to just react, and he stopped, and she convinces him, oh no, you'll get 3 times as much stuff if you wait later than you will now. So now it's a possible future, and do it indirectly instead of just react the normal way. Wait. But that's really as far as Achilles goes with it. But that being able to stop and not react is the starting point for Odysseus. He's doing that all the time. He's that's what allows you to be dexterous, because otherwise you're just doing something on autopilot. You're just that thing about generals fight the last war. So you would just do the thing you did before, and it's a slightly different situation. It doesn't work now. So you need to be able to.
He's staying constantly in that pocket of being engaged with his environment and thinking about his environment at all times. It's not, like you said, it's not autopilot. He's in that highly focused mode. Even though it may not always come across as complete focus, it's like he's always there. He's always engaged, and I think that is. I don't know. That seems important to me. Like that's more of the spirit of where you want to be if you're actually changing your environment or being a player in the world. You haven't outsourced yourself to all these other things. Like you're always making the decisions. You're leading yourself as opposed to being led by anything else or a past self or whatever it may be.
And there's the other thing I've noticed with the Greeks in particular is that they, like with the god Hermes, he's the god of, he has like winged sandals or winged feet. So he's like very fast. He's like the god of the gymnasiums, some of them the athletics later. So there's this athletic physical speed component, but also it's the god who invents or gives language. So you've got the same person, the same being is responsible for like physical quick-wittedness and mental quick-wittedness. So like Bernstein even says something similar. He says, motor wits transforms itself into mental wits. I can't remember the phrase he uses, but like just by it naturally develops out of it. So like and he also uses an example, Bernstein uses an example of a pole vaulter, a Russian pole vaulter years ago, who, in order to get really, so pole vault is an example of his basically dexterity. It's not really any of the other things. It's just like it's a really skillful thing. You have to be dexterous use of balance. There's loads of factors into it. But this guy, because he was wanting to get good at this, what looks like a physical activity, it put him on a mission to learn the mechanics, and he starts studying all these, what we'd normally think of as academic subjects, in order to get better at this physical activity. So that just shows, in order to get better at the physical stuff, it's a natural instinct for humans to, for sort of mental reasoning to come out of try to get better at the practical activity. Modern life, maybe the mental reasoning is broke free of a lot of the practical activity too much, but they came from the same place. You know, words, the fast guy and the words and language coming from the same place. These are like either, these are like deep intuitions or archetypes or whatever. There's something to this. And then it's all over Odysseus there. He's in control of his words as well as his body. They say he's doing both of these at the same time for a reason. They're not just saying stuff randomly. There's a meaning to this, why all these things go together. There's a meaning why they're comparing him to Menelaus in that moment. It's to bring out what we're now calling dexterity, or the resourcefulness. And ever since I found this book, this is like, you just see it everywhere now. It really reminds me of, I heard Nassim Taleb say that about, or he writes that about Anti-Fragile, that once, there wasn't really a name for it before, but then once you have the name for it, you realize it's half of life. Well, dexterity is half of life. And we just haven't noticed it because we just have this mentality of people are learning these specific things and then just plug them into each activity, or each thing they have to do, they just use these skills. But really, there's this developing intelligent physical behavior, or physical behavior is becoming more and more intelligent as things get more and more complex. And there's more and more need to get more and more dexterous, more and more intelligent, the more and more complex it gets. It's kind of the two things feed each other, because the more practical wisdom people have, the more they can create things that are practically wise. But the less you have, and if people lose their touch or they outsource their dexterity, it's not a surprise when things start falling apart and things become fragile and no one knows how to do anything anymore.
Yeah, I was going to, as you were saying this, the idea came to my mind that you can, most of the time you notice things by their contrast, or you notice things when it's starting to go away. So over the past, 3 decades or whatever, we have more growth towards like a digital life where everything's siloed, and it's kind of like a break from reality. So like prior to computers, the internet, most of the time people, like, their lives were physical almost entirely. So like you had to be dexterous. It was just part of it was the water you were swimming in at all times. And you don't notice that until you're not swimming in the water anymore, that, oh, wow, that was really important. So it's you notice it because maybe, not saying that it's absent now, but maybe there are situations where it's not as prevalent. So someone that can make a living on a computer, working with spreadsheets all day, doesn't necessarily like a physical dexterity is not that important to them, to their livelihood, so to speak. Not to say that it's not important to their life, but to the actual in and out day-to-day type thing. And maybe that's why it's more recognizable now, because there is a contrast in that it's not there for a lot of people, whereas it was just a given in the past that it was always there, or part of daily life.
Yeah, it's there's a lot, like there's a movement of people, well, like younger guys interested in self-development now towards, knowing that you need to be good in different spheres in life. But it's still not quite dexterity the way they're looking at it. It's more just covering all the bases rather than this is your way of being. This is like the natural way of being. And there's a way of living like this. And you cultivate it. Because there's another thing Bernstein says is you're not born dexterous. You're not born with movements. You have to construct the movements. And people come to different solutions for their movements. So like I say all the time with posture, people they construct some solutions to walking early on in life, and then they just forget about them and automate them for the rest of their life, and then wonder why they have problems later. They stopped learning how to construct movements, actually construct multiple movements at the same time. But when they were a kid, they really had to be focused on the moment, try to figure out how to do something to get something to happen, to get from one place to another, and we kind of just lose that when you go to school or whatever. The academic staff is separated from the physical staff, if you can even get very much physical stuff anymore, and they're just sort of treated separately. But I mean, if you look at Homer, these things are just assumed to be all intertwined and connected together. It's assumed poetry goes with war. I mean, doesn't go in modern. That's weird for modern people. It's just assumed then. It's assumed that being a good speaker and being a good fighter go together. Although they have different styles. So for us now, the challenge for people is how to wire these things back together in a way that's kind of real, that really is whole, and not just kind of patchwork of different things from different places. So that's where I'm at with it now. Try to figure out the best way of doing this, because I don't consider myself like a ultra dexterous person by nature or anything. That's not why I'm interested in this. I'm interested in this because I noticed a gap between what I was wanting to be able to do and what I could do. And this seems to be the key. I've never really focused on learning it this way before. I never really thought about learning to do physical things will make me smarter. And I never really thought about becoming smarter and learning things should always be being applied to something physical at the same time. And you're kind of bringing the two things together. So what do you think about that?
Well, the last thing that you said right there, where doing or learning intellectual things being applied to physical things. The most recent example of that I've seen is what you just mentioned before, is anti-fragile. When Taleb coined that term, I don't know if he actually created, whatever it is, but it became popular at least when he started using it. And I see that so often now being used in physical domains, like people, you're making your body anti-fragile, you're making your movement practice anti-fragile when you incorporate X, Y, and Z. So maybe that's a growing trend, and we're kind of picking up on it. I don't know, but I think that you're right to look at it this way, where it's like you have your the intellectual things that people do or think about or whatever. You have the physical things that people do and think about, but they don't cross over the gap very much. And you're missing out on a big component of reality. And maybe a problem here is that a lot of the intellectual things that people are doing don't necessarily cross over to the physical easily. Like if you're reading philosophy or poetry or great literature, the concepts, the themes, those may be able to cross over physically, but the like modern intellectual endeavor, which is more, I don't even know what you would consider it. Like if you are like a modern intellectual endeavor might be more so like computer programming or coding or financial trading, does that necessarily cross over to the physical domain, or do people cross that over to the physical domain? I'm sure there's instances, but it's just not as common. Like the intellectualism has been, or intellectual enterprise has kind of been boiled out of the physical arenas of life for a while now, and how do you get people to integrate that back in or cross over the gaps between them? I don't know. That's a tough question. I got to think about that a bit more.
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons we're doing this, is to kind of explore this idea. So, I mean, anyone's watching this, get in touch with us, talk about it, give us examples that you're working on. Quotes from old books as well. This is what people have to figure out themselves. So, like, our podcast is called Psychophysical, and Dexterity is like psychophysical, obviously, but it's more. Psychophysical is broader, but Dexterity is more like. I mean, we're focusing more on movements because we're involved in movements in our work, but it's in the actual experience of dealing with it. It isn't a physical thing. You're thinking about what you're doing. You're plotting and scheming new things. You're analyzing how things worked. You're implementing things. You're experimenting. I mean, what's an experiment? It's your mind affecting your mind in charge of the body of the physical. You're doing things in the physical world based on mental concepts that no one could see. They just see you doing something, and then you do something new based on what you learned from that. So, like, I mean, if you're swinging a mace around your head in the garden, I like this example. You're learning things about what you can and can't do. You're learning how not just to physically be able to do it, but you're learning what's safe, what's not. You're learning, if I can do this, if I can sort of break the restricted types of exercises like this by doing this, I wonder what in my other part of my life, what can I do that would make it more free, or more other options that I'm artificially restricting myself in a different situation. And then by the time you're doing this naturally, it becomes your way of being. All of those areas of your life start dexterously combining together and changing things. And you're all this while you're becoming a different person. You're changing the environment around you. You're changing the people around you. You might change the people, changing the people who are there, but also changing to the different people because you're a different person. And all of this is just from not treating physical, mental as separate things, not treating developing them both as separate things, assuming that part of being better physically is going to develop you mentally, and being better mentally is going to develop you physically. Even these words are already separated. To use the words is already separating them in a way that I don't think like the Greeks really separated them like that. Just speculating obviously, but based on what I've read, they don't seem to. And this is dexterity.
Yeah, that's very well said. Is there anything else that you have down here that you want to go into?
Well, there's tons of. I've gone on enough tangents already today, so like maybe we do another one on some specific stuff that we mentioned, and obviously go more into the details in the book, because we've only touched on the sort of basic ideas. So, why is one last question? Why is dexterity important now? Why are we doing this?
Oh, good question. Part of it, I think, is reasserting. This is something that we had talked about in one of our episodes of the podcast too, but it's reasserting agency and competency to each person as an individual, to not have to outsource these things, to be more dependent on yourself in all these different situations, or whatever situation you may find yourself in. So if you can develop your ability to figure things out mentally, figure things out physically. Like that is the skill that you actually like. That's resourcefulness, figuring things out, dexterity. Those are all, they're honing in on something that is really important to have as an individual. Is one, it creates a dependency, not or an independency of the self. So you could find yourself in any situation, and if you have the skill to figure it out, or kind of play with that situation, you're just going to be kind of a force to be reckoned with, and not have to outsource all these different things to other people, or you just become more self-reliant. And I think that's the biggest part of, or one of the most important things about dexterity, is learning to depend on yourself through any mental or physical situation that you find yourself in. I mean, for me, that's why part of the reason why I train, why I do, is so if I'm in some type of like natural environment, that I can handle it, and I don't get scared or freak out, or I mean, there's a little bit of component of that depending on where you find yourself. But yeah, it creates a sense of courage or faith that you'll be able to depend on yourself through all these different situations and navigate them. So I think that's the biggest component of dexterity, why people should treat it as really important for your life, because it is. And the less that the more you could depend on yourself, the more you could help support other people too. So I mean, that's just like a major thing as well. So the thing on planes, they say put your face mask on before you put your child's on or something. It's a cliche, but it rings true. You become more self-reliant, dependent, or independent, and you could trust and have faith that you'll be able to navigate all the different chaotic situations that life throws at you. What would you say? What's anything different?
I agree with that 100%. Yeah. And I would just add that when you start developing yourself in this way, there's a quote spiritual component to it too. You start, everything becomes more meaningful. Just everything, the physical world, the things you're learning, you'll read differently because you're really trying to integrate it with things you're doing. You're not just interested in just reading random books about facts. It doesn't appeal to you unless it kind of integrates with what you're doing. Your relationships with people will change because you're more of an integrated person, but also you're doing different things. You can see where other people are maybe missing ability to do something because they're kind of too rigid and got things in boxes that they need help. You maybe even become more generous to people because you have skills and abilities they don't have, and you want to share them. So there's an element of showing off. You want to do the cool thing that other people can't do, but I think that's natural, healthy for when you're younger. If that's the only thing you have, it's not natural and healthy, but that's part of it. But part of it is sharing and giving and helping people with your skill. I mean, all these heroes in culture, the dexterous hero, he's all saving people. He's not just saving himself. No one likes the guy who uses his dexterous skills to steal and to take advantage of people. But they love the hero.
Yeah. So that's another thing. What came to mind is like to show things off isn't necessarily to boast or brag, but it's to show people what's possible as well. Like, and maybe they can, if they see it, they say, "Oh, that's within my grasp as well to be able to do those things." I had something else as you were saying that too, but I forgot it.
mean, that's why I'm doing this, talking about this. It's not, as I said, it's not because I think I'm this dexterous guy who, oh, I'm this great person at this thing. Here's how to be like me, buy my course or whatever. It's more, this is a really important thing. It's everywhere in life. Now, as soon as you see it, you're like, oh, everything's makes sense, more sense now. And want to get better at it, and to just like a normal guy can get better at like this. We don't know how much of the differences between people is that they haven't really tried to train dexterity properly. We don't know. We don't know how much of it's just, like nature versus nurture. You don't really know, because so something like coordination, coordination is, it's not something in your brain that you just have and then you go around using your coordination. Coordination is together, movements together, ordering movements together is coordination. So you can practice ordering movements together and coordinate yourself better. It's out in the world, and then dexterity is built from all the different coordinations you have. So you can get better. Anyone can get better. I mean, it's one of the things Bernstein talks about. One of his features of dexterity is its exercisability. You can improve it. A seemingly average person can get really good at dexterity without appearing to have the natural gifts that, like a big, tall, strong, big, bulky, tall guy would have in certain ways. And some people are just, naturally smarter or whatever. But dexterity is something everybody can improve and get better at in any sphere, anything they're doing.
Yeah. I remember the thing that I forgot just before. And what it is that dexterity is also an invitation to re-engage with life in a very meaningful way. And I think that's what you brought up, that when you look at life through this lens, everything starts to have more meaning, and there's maybe a more spiritual component to it. But there's so much, the default is to be checked out on a lot of things and put things on autopilot and just not have to think about things. Convenience, comfort, all become like those are kind of what's pushed a lot. But when you focus on something or see things through this lens of dexterity, you realize that there's so much reward when you actually are present and deeply engaged with what you're doing in terms of thinking about it, figuring things out. You put yourself in the moment, and you're fully in the life that you have. So I think that is oh man, I mean, that I don't want to sound like I'm just kind of like spouting philosophical nonsense, but that's really important. Like, I don't think that people really get engaged in their lives anymore, and they try to put stuff on autopilot, and they want everything scheduled and all this. They don't want to have to think about everything. But what we're suggesting is that no, your life is actually meant to be. You're supposed to be thinking about what you're doing all the time. Like you want to be interested in your life and what you're doing, and dexterity in terms of a perspective may be the doorway or whatever path you need to re-engage with all those important things and understand that your actions are mattering to your life and all those and so it has a magnitude to it that's simmering under the surface that it's easily graspable if anybody wanted to reach out, but sometimes you just don't notice that it's there until you have two fools like us coming on the internet and saying that it is. So yeah, I don't know. It's also good stuff, and maybe got a little bit too I don't know, philosophical, whatever you want to call it there.
I think there's a reason that we did, though, because it is philosophical. It's practical philosophy, or okay, that's what we'll call ourselves, practical philosophers.
Perfect. Like, we'll get high praise from everyone.
But yeah, so yeah, that's the book. Dexterity and Its Development by Nikolai Bernstein. Highly recommend it to people. It's not necessarily an easy read, but it's well written. It's engaging, and there's a lot to learn. You'll want to read it more than once. And if you're watching this and you're interested, let us know. Contact us on Twitter. We'll put our links underneath if you want to get in touch. Keith, if you want to train your dexterity, Keith, that's what Keith does a lot with in his fitness business. The link's underneath. If you want to apply dexterity to posture and kind of mind-body relationship issues, then I'll put a link to my stuff underneath. We can do that. But in general, it's just something you can be doing on your own. You were doing this as a child anyway. We're just saying keep doing what you were learning as a child by your nature, and do it as an adult. And you've got more tools as an adult. You've got more experience, but you've got more mental tools to be able to get even more dexterous and to plan out even better things. And the very fact that you can decide to engage in activities that will increase your dexterity is a type of dexterity itself. So have fun and play with it.
Yeah. All right. Sounded good. Thanks for tuning in, everybody that stayed to the end. And we will see you in the future.
Yeah, cool. Cheers, Keith.